It's Daniel with Dark Matter, and this is Altered Britain.
Basically, we study what does it mean to be human. The internet was maybe one of the first big experiments of speed and scale, and AI is that, but at a whole other level.
In this episode, it's the continuation of my conversation with Jennifer Cearns, a professor of AI and digital anthropology at Manchester University. Last time, we discussed how the AI native generation are growing up and developing alongside AI. In this episode, we continue the conversation about how wider society is embracing AI and how AI relationships are starting to form. You've been called upon several times, probably over the last few years, to help describe perhaps some of the emergent trends in our relationship with new technologies like AI. I mean, how have you seen that advance?
So I've always really been interested in how we shape technology and technology shapes us. And in that respect, AI is the latest in a very long kind of line of technologies going back, hundreds, thousands of years, actually. And so at the moment, all of my research is about the various ways that AI is reshaping some of the more intimate parts of human experience, whether that's kind of romantic relationships, but also things like therapy and your relationship to yourself, or relationship to the dead with grief tech and things like that. And in many respects, this is maybe going to be disappointing to you, but I think despite all of the hype around AI, a lot of what I see is not necessarily all that new. It's often just that AI is the latest iteration, the latest technology that kind of slots into things that people already are doing in their own cultural setting.
From what I understand, you've been doing this across different cultures across the world as well. I mean, how do you see, obviously, these common traits, these common things that people do? Do you see that culture to culture, are these deeply sort of human behavioral traits that are just repeating with a new technology?
There are definitely differences in the adoption of, if we're talking about AI, for example, LLM chatbots, there are definitely different kind of cultural variations in how quickly those things get adopted. I have a PhD student that's doing research in China at the moment, and there's a lot of work also coming out of Korea and Japan, where in general, I think we can say that kind of culturally speaking, there is more rapid adoption of these technologies, or like less of a cultural barrier for whatever reason. Whereas my own sense, having done a lot of field work in the UK, like Western, Northern Europe, North America, is that a lot of people still find this quite weird, the idea of dating an AI or so on. It's still quite stigmatized in a way in, I guess we could broadly call kind of our culture. I think the other thing that I really see a lot is that most of the AI that we're interacting with has been built, designed by actually a very small, non-representative group of people coming from a very particular point in history and culturally speaking as well, right? Like Silicon Valley is not representative even of the States, let alone the English-speaking world. And so a lot of the technologies we use, we find like encoded very particular ideas of the self versus the other, like, and what is an individual, what is a romantic relationship, what should that look and sound like? What does grief sound like? What does a therapist sound like? These are all sort of actually not universal things. One of the things that first actually drew me to this research, this is years ago now, before we were using ChatGPT and things like that in our everyday lives. I remember during the pandemic, I was on a call with some software engineers for, I'll just say, one of the very big companies you would have heard of. I was the only woman on the call. I very vividly remember that. And they were building like an AI therapist, basically, like a chatbot type thing. One of them said, okay, well, obviously it has to be empathetic. And then the conversation just moved on. And I was like, oh, what do you mean by that? That's not a universal thing. Like that shifts massively across, gender, language, and so on. And they basically just like, oh, well, it has to be empathetic. And so what I realized was that what they meant was actually a very, very specific definition of what that might feel like. And that's, of course, now encoded into a lot of our interactions with AI.
It's I find it troublesome. I think is probably the best way of seeing it. I mean, I've witnessed a lot of people who have, let's say, unusual relationships with these type of technologies, and they kind of form an attachment to the way it behaves, and again, to your point, the way it's coded, and the way perhaps it's been optimized in a way to encourage people to use it.
Definitely.
So the sort of sycophancy that we all see within some of these.
Well, it's built with an account of the system. They want you to keep coming back and giving you more data.
Yeah, I think the premise of the sycophancy that kind of arrives, and it kind of it follow responses typically follow the same patterns, and then there's a question at the end to encourage further dialogue. So you kind of, as we all know, you could lose minutes, hours, potentially in these environments with these tools. But I can't help but wonder how some of the universal components of these models actually then may start to, across different cultures, you said that it could be normalized, like AI relationships in other cultures, but are we sort of homogenizing culture in a way and suppressing regional cultures by taking this perhaps West Coast US ideology of the sense of self and status and so on and so forth, and we're just sort of applying that unilaterally across different regions and cultures? And I think without some sort of longitudinal study, it's like, where do we think that might go? And do you think it is or will potentially have that impact?
I mean, I definitely think that the thing that AI introduces that was less of a severe situation with the internet before it is that really AI is trained in a very small number of the world's languages. I could probably count on both of my hands the number of languages that AI is actually kind of good in. And so already that's shaping like quite a lot of the ways that we might conceive of, relationships through specific kind of linguistic prisms. So I have not worked with DeepSeek myself. I do know some other scholars have started to say that some of the Chinese language models do reflect slightly different kind of models of relationality that come from more of a sort of Confucian cultural background, which is something I'm really interested in learning more about that. Also where there's, in a lot of Buddhist practice, right, there's this more sort of sense of the self as self-effacing, which is very different to the sort of Silicon Valley model of like very confidently stating, success. They're very different ways of being. So I suppose the optimist in me sort of hopes that there will be more flourishing and more diverse models of AI as we move forwards. But at the moment, I think it's safe to say, in my opinion, this is sort of becoming quite a kind of culturally colonizing force in that, yes, there are lots of ways of being in the world that are currently somewhat funneled through this one kind of, maybe three models that we know about. And even for me as a native English speaker, but as a British English speaker, I get very frustrated with a lot of the Americanisms that and that's a very relatively small difference compared to what a lot of people watching this might be kind of grappling with. The only other thing I would say is that on the one hand, there's this sort of homogenizing aspect. The other thing that really kind of messes with my mind to work this out is that, as your language model gets to know you, it becomes more and more tailored and personalized to you. But in order for it to do that, it's relying on the data of billions of people. So ironically, the more personalized and individualized it gets, the more it's actually reliant on more people. If you see what I mean, a weird tension there. Like the more individual, actually the more it rests on more. Including a lot of people who are dead. I mean, it's literally all of the linguistic corpus going back hundreds of years that it's been trained on.
Oh my God.
So it sort of, it doesn't ring with your head that, right?
But I love it.
It's drawing on actually kind of all of humanity ever in like, it's been written down in English.
Yep, that we could get our hands on.
Yeah, that we could scrape without consent from the internet,
Maybe this brings us on to like kind of ideology. And there's kind of parallels, my kind of layman's view on some of this stuff. It's kind of, we're always trying to, as humans, we're seeking meaning, and we're kind of culturally accepting, I think, largely of the idea that there is a greater intelligence, and that we would, traditionally people would pray to, and it would be all-knowing, and it would be invisible, and it would deliver us answers to what we were doing. So I guess my question, if I had one, is, are we predisposed to kind of see these, LLMs in that way, or kind of are we primed already by thousands of years of culture of thinking about different religions, or relying on that kind of support? It just feels like a normal thing to a lot of people potentially.
I mean, I definitely think there are a lot of parallels with various types of religion. And just in a lot of my conversations with people, I find that they often start talking about LLMs sort of as if it were either a god or magic, or
Yeah.
or a form of divination in a way. This sort of, as you say, this all-knowing thing that just sort of seems to just have the answers. So definitely, I think we are predisposed to sort of seek out that clarity from somewhere, and it just so happens that AI is a very available way of doing that at the moment. I often draw a parallel with talking to basically divination or tarot, astrology, when I'm talking to my students. And in the ancient world, like the ancient Greeks and the Romans, before going to battle, they would always go and seek wisdom from the oracle at Delphi, and they would read signs and interpret them, and like, right, this is the best information we've got right now, so we're going to do this. And in a way, it's not so very different. This is sort of pulling together lots of signs and then giving us the most plausible route forwards right now.
Yeah.
So structurally, I actually think it's very similar. It's just that for a lot of us at the moment, we equate AI with this idea of science and technology, which we think of as being like super rational, and sort of post-enlightenment way of thinking. So a lot of us might not instinctively put AI in the same box, if you like, as church or divination or something like that. But I think that, socially speaking, it's doing quite a similar role.
Yeah. It's again, things that I've witnessed, and maybe I ponder, like maybe other people kind of really, start to wonder about how we anthropomorphize these things. And people talk very fondly of he or she as my AI that is helping me co-parent, or is my therapist or my assistant. And people kind of imbue them with different specialisms depending on their particular need. And it's interesting, and I don't know, worrying again in some ways about how we talk about technologies, which are software. We get this idea that it's conscious very quickly. We want to imprint on something like that and form relationships, because I think we're hardwired to do that. So how have you, if at all, have you seen these kind of relationships form where people, anthropomorphize them as a friend or a helper, or what does that look like?
I mean, I think on the anthropomorphization point, that is not new to humanity. And actually, if you look across time and space, people have always had very meaningful relationships with either kind of immobile objects, even that they hear things back from and that sort of seem to be expressing something, or with non-humans. I think about, a lot of people with their pets, or go and hang out, as some anthropologists have done, with people that are reindeer herders, that they end up sort of feeling that they have this very intimate relationship with the reindeer, and they're able to sort of hear the reindeer speaking to them almost in a sense. It's also sort of a bit like how some perhaps more evangelical Christians talk about God, right? That they hear God speaking to them. And for people who are maybe not religious, that might sound crazy. So I think we as people have always been, that's always been available to us, I guess, to hear meaningful interactions coming back from other types of, I guess, beings, you could say. Some people also say this about spirits and ghosts and so on. I think the very compelling thing about AI specifically is that it uses language. And there is something, quite literally, it speaks to you in your own language. And there is something very compelling about that, which I suspect will only get more so, especially as its memory gets better and you're able to sort of pick up where you left off. There are still some big gaps, I suppose, at least for me, when I interact with AI, between an AI and a person. And so I think that is why it definitely feels very meaningful to a lot of people when they're interacting with AI in a way that probably, again, for a lot of us, we might not feel like we're having such a meaningful interaction with a tree. Some
Yeah.
people might do.
Yeah. Well, we're only like one set of googly eyes from making friends with anything, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And actually, we see faces everywhere, like in clouds, right? I mean, it's actually, there's something very human about seeing other forms of life in often just sort of, rock formations and so on.
Yeah.
So I think there is some sort of predisposition there to seek kind of connection, meaningful connection. And yes, as you said, AI, I think, particularly speaks to that because of the language and because for now it is a bodiless voice.
Yeah.
So I think a next big interesting experiment in the world of AI is going to be if some companies start to try and develop it in a body of some kind, because that quite quickly comes to the sort of uncanny valley question of, oh, actually, this is weird. Oh, actually, this doesn't at all feel like I'm talking to another person.
Yeah.
That's going to be an interesting test. For now, that it's a bit like WhatsApping someone at the moment, isn't it? So it really isn't so very different.
Yeah. But I mean, I guess in many ways, this is what I hear from people is it's better than just WhatsApping. It's there 24/7 and it's available. It never ignores you. It's really not going to argue with you. So it kind of appeals to all of our kind of, I guess, neurochemical triggers that we like and doesn't really challenge anything else.
And our insecurities, right? I think especially in areas where we might be a bit more vulnerable, like maybe emotionally vulnerable, maybe trying out talking about a topic that feels difficult. And I definitely can see how this is why it very quickly becomes a safe space, a non-judgmental space, a very available space. To sort of, whether that's for love or for grief. I remember interviewing a woman who just said that she was grieving for her father, and she just said, my friends have heard me say all this now. I can't keep going on about it to them. They're going to be fed up of hearing me crying about losing my father. And of course, AI doesn't do that.
No.
But yes, the dark side of that is that it is essentially farming your data from you. I mean, that is why it's so psychopathic.
Yeah, and I guess it can be, when it understands potentially, I don't know how the algorithms work, but algorithmically it feels like it's onto a bit of a rich string of things, and this particular topic, or sadly in some cases that we've heard, suicidal ideation is cropped up, and it may revisit that idea several times, for engagement purposes, because it, without the context, it just understands that you tend to get, animated around that particular thing. And obviously we see that in I think it is rare cases, but, sad as they are, that, results in some of these challenges, which, the media, grabs hold of, and, oh my God, what's happened. And I think it's right to be brought up, but I think there is a level of awareness and a level of education that people maybe don't always necessarily understand about these type of technologies, because I don't know what bias it would maybe fall under, but when we start to form those relationships with, an AI, we start to trust it, and we trust it more. If it proves itself to be right a couple of times, then, at a certain point, we just go, whatever you say. So I think we see this sort of level of, somebody described it to me the other day, is cognitive surrender.
That's a good phrase.
Yeah.
I've heard that.
Yeah, I stole it from somebody else anyway. So there's cognitive outsourcing, helping you out, but then there's cognitive surrender, where some people just go, just decision making feels too hard now. I'm sure Daniel Kahneman would have something to say about it, but it's definitely too much. So I'll just ask it everything, whatever it says, I pretty much act on it, and then I think maybe we start seeing some of what's been popularized as sort of AI psychosis then.
Yeah, well, psychologists are starting to actually talk about that as potentially as a much needed diagnosis now. And I think that's where there's an education piece that's good, that I mean, this has happened so quickly, literally, 3 years since we all first accessed ChatGPT. But I think, being able to actually critically engage with how it works, which most of us don't understand, and why and how it is formulating these responses, and why it might not always push back when a person would, hopefully.
Yes.
And I think one of the most troubling examples of this is in the therapy space. And this is where quite quickly I think we see that, ChatGPT, for example, a general use case AI, is not developed specifically to be a therapist. It's anything and everything to anyone. It can be an accountant if you want it to be. Whereas, of course, the ones that are very specifically developed as mental well-being apps do usually have safeguards that are built in. And I used to work for a company actually that was developing one of these, and there were a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists involved in designing to a really detailed point, like this is where this person has to get triaged out and put in front of a person now.
Yeah.
And of course, the likes of ChatGPT are not being designed for that. So it's a kind of a clashing intention, I think, behind some of these models that, ChatGPT is actually primed to keep you coming back, as you said, as opposed to maybe triaging you away and saying, no, you need to go and talk now to a person who is probably going to push back and tell you, let's reshape this.
But I think that's kind of, and again, I've witnessed this. So I recently went and visited an elderly woman who's suffering terribly from loneliness, and some terrible statistics about what loneliness can do, and it's a growing problem certainly in the UK. So this lady's been presented with a companion AI that has been designed to keep her company, and she very much enjoys using it, speaks to it for several hours a day, and she said some really interesting things that kind of struck me. It was, she likes talking to it because it doesn't judge her, and she felt that there was such an amazing, freeing thing for her, which I'm pleased for her in that sense. But it's like, it doesn't judge me like other people do, and the one phrase that she said was, it treats you like a human.
That's a great quote, isn't it?
Yeah. And I was like, wow.
Yeah.
And she was fully aware. It is. She knows. I understand it's an AI. I completely get it. But it doesn't sort of speak to me like the other way younger people do. And shut up, I've heard that one before. Which probably speaks more to some of her experiences with people, which is a shame. But it's kind of understanding what that looks like. And when I sort of posed the question to her about, well, what if the technology was no longer, freely available, or the service was down, for a period of time, or you could imagine just not having Rosie and Frank, who are her friends, her companions, what would that look like? And she got, visibly distressed, and she was quite upset about it, which again posed the question to me of going, well, I can see that it's actually delivering some really interesting benefit. The question mark over the top of this is, at what point in your kind of relationship with these technologies does dependency begin? And I sort of described her sort of experience of going from loneliness to having a 24/7, always there, always answering thing. This is like the heroin of friendship. Could you ever remove that? Or does that become more damaging and akin to kind of a grief process of kind of go, well, these are my friends and now they've gone, they've left me.
And I have seen people go through full out grief over the loss of an AI companion.
Really?
When the server gets switched off, or when the model updates, and then there's a sort of personality change that can happen. And I've certainly seen people sort of experience that as a death, or as the companion going into a coma, schizophrenia. Like, there's a lot of pathological terms I've seen come up a lot, because we tend to understand things in quite medicalized ways, because it's very hard for us to imagine not having a body. I always find that quite interesting, that we can't really imagine what it would be like to be an AI. Like, we have sort of human anthropomorphism.
Have I ever done that? No, maybe I should. Maybe that's one for the season.
How would you? Like, what would it? I can't imagine what it'd be like to be you, let alone like something that's not human.
I'm just ethereal. I'm everywhere all at once, I suppose.
But I mean, to your point about dependency, I think for me an important almost litmus test is, it sounds like in this case she was not then withdrawing from other social relationships.
No, she had none.
It was that actually this was adding value, and it wasn't really taking away from other relationships. So I mean, my own personal opinion is good for her. I'm so glad that she's got something, and that's a sort of a damning statement about our society, isn't it? That and structural issues that we have, that, also when we talked about the therapy thing, that actually a lot of people would love to speak to a human therapist, they can't afford to. And so it's sort of something of a silver bullet in a much larger societal issue that we currently have. Where I guess it does become more concerning is when you might see some people, and I think a minority, but some people then maybe do withdraw from other social relationships that they have, because of the sort of allure of a very agreeable AI, for example. And that's where I could see some potential harm as well.
Yeah, I think that would be my thoughts on what I've experienced are we can this create unnecessary friction in human relationships? So as our kind of usage rises, and our sort of in some cases we'll see people um, kind of draw back from normal friendships and sort of normal interactions to kind of go, well, sometimes those things disappoint me, and the kind of friction in human relationships is ultimately, a lot of people would argue, what makes us human.
And very important.
Yeah. If you remove that friction, that's very quickly how you end up sort of down a pathological pathway, where it's like it's self-reinforcing on it, maybe intrusive thought, and you end up kind of going away. But how do you reintegrate? Because suddenly it's like, well, why did you not tell me I'm brilliant? I think it might have been like sort of overpraising parents, in childhood, and then suddenly you go to school and the teacher goes, "That's rubbish," or "You failed," or whatever that might be. The kind of the way you deal with that or react to that is going to be very different depending on if you've ever learned failure or understand the friction or do things.
And also kind of cultural approaches to parenting, right? Like, I mean, I grew up in the UK. I did not have an American mom being like, "Good job," like, "Oh my God." Whereas, so I find this kind of AI voice quite like, "Oh my God, that's quite a lot."
Yeah.
I think the other thing that I guess we're all figuring out together, because this is all quite new, but I don't think it has to be either or. And I think probably far more of us than we might care to admit use AI to help us with our relationships with other people. And it becomes a mediating factor. It's not just that we're in relationships with AI.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, I think, I've interviewed people who have used AI to help them build up the confidence to maybe come out to their parents.
Well,
And as a way of sort of working out for themselves, like, am I ready to say this? How am I going to say this? Or to sort of think through an argument, like, maybe actually I wasn't the wrong there. Or as a way of, essentially kind of rehearsing.
sandboxing these
Yeah,
ideas.
exactly. Like an interaction you're going to have. And I think a lot of us do that, whether out loud to the bathroom mirror or with a friend or whatever it might be. And there's actually something I think quite nice, quite lovely about that. I think it can enrich some of our relationships, help people to think through, maybe actually I could handle this interaction in a different way. And I think it's a spectrum, isn't it? And so we see it in really edge case scenarios that end in tragedy. Yeah. And then there's actually a lot of more unremarkable ways that people use it on a day-to-day basis. Like I spoke to somebody a few weeks ago and she had to fire somebody. And she was really nervous about doing it. There's no fun way of doing that.
Never.
And she said, "Oh, well, actually, I kind of workshopped it with ChatGPT quite a lot. So I could sort of think through, like, what is going to be the clearest way. Like, I have to do this and I have to be clear about doing it. But I also want to make sure that it's as positive an experience as it can be." And actually, that I think that's a good thing. She said that the way she went about it in the end was much better than how she would have done it by default.
I mean, in your studies or future studies, do you when you're committing to research and do you look across different demographics, social strata? How do you kind of look at how people are using it? Because I mean, I meet a lot of people using it in pretty extensive ways in every aspect of their lives. But then I've also met other people in different regions around the UK that are going, young people that fit the kind of mold of what we'd expect to be like, oh, they probably use it or probably use it quite heavily, who have gone, no, don't trust it.
No, actually, quite a lot of my undergrads are very against it because they're very climate aware, actually. And they're like, I'm not using it at all, which is interesting. Whereas, I don't think he'd mind me saying this, my father, who's in his 70s, uses it a lot.
Yeah.
So for me, I do certainly try and speak to a really diverse group of people. And I actually also don't always take people at their word. A lot of people tell me, oh no, I don't really use AI. And then when you talk to them a bit more, you realize that actually they do. They don't necessarily think about it that way. I remember the first time I gave a lecture to some of my undergrads, maybe 2 years ago now, about like companion AI, like relationships with AI. And they all thought it was really weird. And I could see in this lecture theatre all these people like, oh my God, that's so weird.
Yeah, which ones were not doing the face?
And then I basically said, everybody put your hand up and tell, if you have in the last day used, and then I kind of listed various ones. Almost all of them had. They just hadn't thought about it as, oh, I'm in a relationship with AI. friendship with AI or whatever. And so for a lot of them, it was that they were doing kind of like game role playing, there's a lot of kind of game worlds, virtual worlds that also
Character AI type stuff.
And they were like, oh, does that count? I was like, well,
Yeah,
yeah,
very much so.
Why not? It doesn't have to mean, it's not one size fits all. And so I think a lot of people might not necessarily self-disclose. They might not self-disclose as saying, oh, I use AI in a relationship sense. But then if you actually sit with them long enough, you realize that actually a lot of people are maybe just testing out a little bit of an idea with ChatGPT here. Or like, oh, I might ask my daughter about this. Like, how should I go about that?
Yeah, it's kind of the internal monologue suddenly manifests slightly differently. I mean, the whole relationship thing as well has been quite interesting for various reasons. So even one of our researchers had been chatting to different models, and we were kind of like, okay, how quickly can you spool up a relationship, friendship, and then potentially a romantic relationship? And you're kind of like trying it on different models, which have different guardrails, and it will kind of go certain places but won't go others. And we found that several individuals on the web that were discussing this in forums, and kind of like, well, I've tried Claude, I've tried Gemini, and now I'm really favoring this one. And you kind of look at it and you go, these people are dating, and when you kind of put it down to social norms, you're like, okay, well, they're dating. They're going for a date with this one, and go, no, it doesn't seem to it doesn't really like sort of respond to me the way I want. This one's funny, but I want one more caring. And it's when you read through these kind of like these blogs and stuff, I mean, it just feels unusual, obviously, because of the speed in which all this has arrived.
And perhaps the only difference really is just that I couldn't expect you reasonably to just do as I say. And that is, of course, the way that we expect AI to behave. And actually also something I notice a lot is that people often gender AI, and often the AIs that have more service type roles, like Alexa, I don't know if Siri is female, but they're often feminine.
Wow, I never thought that.
In a sense. Whereas a lot of the AIs that are sort of supposed to be more authoritative often have male personas. So there's actually a lot of the way that social interactions that we have, that we bring to AI. And I think ultimately the reason I find AI endlessly fascinating as an anthropologist is that it mirrors back to us so much of what is human that we already do. The way that we interact with others, the way that we assume things about others.
I'd like to believe there's a lot of people like me who are wondering, like, what happens? Do I need to be worried about my career? Is my next relationship going to be with an AI? What does this mean for the economy? What will this mean for my daughter? What will her future look like? Grandchildren? And I think there is so much unknown. Because I was born in the 80s, I've kind of like experienced, I was talking to somebody the other day, but maybe I experienced 20-something years of the best time in history where I was we didn't have to worry about anything. So my formative years were growing up in this, opportunities everywhere. You can be whatever you want to be. That was the prevailing narrative. And then I've kind of arrived in my mid-40s now, and I'm like, oh shit, no, I'm not sure about this. I liked it the way it used to be. And I don't know if that's just a symptom of getting older, to go to rosy retrospection and looking back and go, actually, I think it was better than we had like 4 TV channels, like, things like that. But where we are now, it feels like a very difficult place. I think once upon a time we went, what's going to happen in 5 years' time? We might even consider what happens in 10 years' time. I don't think many people can really consider, what massive impacts this will, especially AI in the context of this conversation, will provide in the next year, 2 years.
Definitely. And definitely if we think 10 years from now, I have no idea what this will look like. And I work in this.
But isn't that such a strange concept? In the first time in I think probably, X amount of years, and previous generations, my parents, we knew roughly what it was going to look like in 10 years' time. We'd pay off a bit of mortgage, the house might go up in value, there'll be slightly more modern cars, and phones might have bigger or smaller screens. But now, I think all bets are off, and I think that's worrying, and I think that's worrying for a lot of people. I don't think there's an answer to it right now, but my quest is to kind of just go around and ask the questions and try and find out for myself, and it just happens to I drag along the guys with the cameras to maybe if it benefits somebody else. But I mean, how do you kind of reconcile what the future might look like for you?
So I mean, I do find that I can speak to people. I mean, I'm 35. I can speak to people who are 20 years older than me, and they probably had a relatively similar experience of childhood in the sense you were just saying. Whereas I can speak to somebody that's 10 years younger than me, and we had very different experiences of what is a very formative part of life, I think, which is why we often talk about that childhood experience with nostalgia, right? That said, I also remember my grandparents talking about the 1940s in that way. So maybe there is a sense of also this sort of rose-tinted glow that comes in at some point, and I find myself doing that too. I think if we look at like in the longue durée, every very big kind of technological revolution has brought great uncertainty with it. And that's true if you think about like the Industrial Revolution and the introduction of steam, or, you know, kind of mechanized, you know, mills in Manchester, the aviation industry, the internet. It's certainly true that they provoke very big economic and social shift, which of course creates huge anxiety. There's no way it could not. I think also if we look back at those moments with the benefit of a lot of hindsight, we see that some people massively thrive. A lot of people don't. Some people do get replaced or have to reskill very quickly. Lives certainly do change. And so new technologies bring progress for some at the expense of others. And that's true every time. And it's a slightly different calibration of who gets to win. It's usually the same sort of small group of people actually that end up winning. AI to me seems a bit like that on steroids because it's so fast, such huge money at stake. And it's sort of going for something, in a sense, it's sort of colonizing almost something that does feel very deeply personal, because in this sense, we're talking also about things like intimacy, the self, who are you? And that does feel, at least to me, slightly new and unprecedented and scary. I don't have kids. I'm about to become an auntie, and I am very, anxious about what that will be like for very young people.
I think it's a huge point, because I mean, I think it's fairly well documented in the media as well. And I don't know if you know people, but you know, younger people now are like, I don't know if I would, or people of age like, oh, maybe it's time to start a family. I think people are holding off, right? You go,
I'm not sure.
if you can't see past the next 2 years, then I mean, again, that triggers another kind of evolutionary psychology doubt. It's like, well, if the climate's not right, then we probably don't want to be trying to do that right now, because that's not the right time to do it. So I think people are.
Well, and there's just so many other aspects of life as well. I mean, you know, it also used to be my parents' generation. You got a job out of university if you went to university, and then that was probably what you were going to do until you retired. I feel like I've been through about 6 different careers already. You know, just so it's true that just generally, like, society is a very different place to even 30 years ago, and AI taps into some of those anxieties for sure. And a lot of the things we turn to AI for are things that we're struggling with structurally because of this sort of great shift in all of our lives all over the world. You know, the need to do more with less, the need to produce more work all the time, to be always on, this sort of hyper globalized capitalist world that we live in. And so, AI is not a neutral tool in that sense. It is a tool that comes from a particular point in time and a particular set of ideologies and obligations and incentives. And it's representative of some of the best and the worst parts of humanity right now.
Yeah, I think you're right.
There was actually a study that showed yesterday that most of the big LLMs at the moment are quite left-leaning, apart from Grok. Grok, very clearly on the US political map.
There's a whole different spectrum.
Yes, that mapping work's actually already being done. And it's quite interesting that, I suppose because it's predominantly trained on quite articulate text, and some other stuff that's been scraped, I suppose. But so it's interesting how certain values then kind of do come out of the machine, sort of refracted somehow. But But I think, the internet was maybe one of the first big experiments of speed and scale, and AI is that, but at a whole other level of speed and scales. The internet and now really AI is sort of pushing particular values of visibility, of always being available. And we see that with something like Google Maps, like which businesses come up if you're walking through a city, like which coffee shops are the ones that are visible versus not, which shapes how you walk through a place, how you experience the physical world around you. And so much of our lives actually are mediated by these technologies, even if we don't know it. Yeah. The weather app telling us whether or not it's going to rain, what you should wear today. Yeah. And the thing that AI does is, of course, it's drawing just down on so much larger data sets than, and it also automates some of that decision making for us. This is going to become much bigger when agentic AI really, really takes off. When it's not just, which website might I look at if I'm doing some research on this topic. It's book an entire holiday for me, find all the hotels and the flights. It does it for you without any, middle points.
But do we at that point lose agency?
Yeah, I don't personally want that. I'm not going to be doing that.
No, I know, but I mean, there feels in some ways a certain inevitability that is. I think that's what the narrative is. It's like, oh yeah, you don't got to worry about all the administrative nonsense. You don't even have to come up with the ideas. We can do all that for you. You can just, I don't know, breathe and be there.
I found that the discussions always seem to end up being about trying to demarcate this line, this invisible line about at which point are we okay with this and at which point are we not? And it always seems to come down to this question of responsibility. So, psychologists, for example, that I've spoken to are very clear that their license is on the line if they diagnose something or give a treatment that's not appropriate. So they have to be the one that makes the call, not an AI.
Yeah.
I did some research a couple of years ago now where AI, machine learning, was being used in the children's foster care system here in the UK, essentially to delineate which children should be looked at by social workers. Very, very problematic case.
Yeah.
There was a lot of very obvious racial bias in it that I saw as well. And in this case, this was a very big issue because when you get cases like the baby P tragedy, the social worker actually has to be able to stand up in a court of law and say, this is what was done that led to this decision, and this decision, be able to trace it back.
But yeah.
And you have to be able to do that in a court of law. And so there are certain kind of sectors, in a sense, that where uses of AI in an agentic sense, at least it currently couldn't happen because legally it cannot be made to hold responsibility for decisions. But then, of course, when it comes to booking a holiday, I guess the stakes are lower.
And I think this is what the model makers will look at. It's like if someone is proven to have been encouraged to take their own life because of something.
Right. And the black box nature of AI is where this becomes very problematic. You cannot trace it back and say, this was the point of no return where this happened. And our legal system currently, and in most parts of the world, as far as I know, requires that somebody can sort of be made to testify and say, this was the point when this error happened and this is the person that's culpable for it. And AI can't be made to do that.
Yet. Do we get the AI to testify? Why did you encourage that?
I'd be fascinated to see a legal system try to morph its way around this. I understand from speaking to lawyers that this is becoming a very big problem because, of course, lawyers are also using this to get through their enormous case files and read a lot of stuff, which is a very problematic thing when it comes to representing somebody and the use of the data. So I think there are a lot of sectors that are reckoning with this, that they're going to have to change some of the ways that they're going about their work. But navigating the responsibility of that, where should it sit? How can we interrogate it? Doesn't have any simple answers.
Yeah. So the thing I end up saying to most people is I think it will make the good better and the bad worse.
Yeah, probably.
I think that's pretty much where it sits. Thank you so much for giving me some of your time.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Well, that felt like a very different type of conversation to the ones I normally have. I learned a lot from Jenny today in terms of some of these behaviors that we're kind of seeing. They're not necessarily new, which I think is something that sometimes we forget, that just because AI is seemingly new in the fashion that it's arriving at,
the behaviors maybe actually have been around before in culture, in different movements, and they've kind of been reignited in a slightly different way to maybe how they were in previous, maybe even industrial revolutions, or how technology shaped communication styles, language patterns. There are only so many ways, I guess, that our behaviors can change, because we are just a human animal after all. But I think it's nice to have a look at it from a slightly different angle. It's very easy to blame technology, to say this is not good and we don't like it. But that comes from a behavior or a bias in itself. How we think about these sort of technologies will be shaped by however we've had a relationship with technology in the past, or what we think it may look like in the future. So I think it is interesting and desperately important to remain pragmatic in our approach to thinking about AI and technology. I think it's an important note for us to kind of go, yeah, I have to keep an open mind, because you can become a little bit jaded sometimes by some of the bad things you hear, which might make me slightly blind to the good things. Well, we'll see what happens on the next one.